Well, good morning, Mobile, and all of our friends along the Gulf Coast this morning. It's exciting to be here at the next version of our Echo Stop Live podcast. And I'm Kevin, by the way, and I looked to my good friend Curtis over here for a minute.
Hey, how's everybody doing?
How are you, Curtis?
How are you, Kevin?
I got a surprise for you.
Another surprise, really?
I have a pretty cool surprise.
Okay, it is Christmas season, so yeah.
Christmas season,
Yeah.
And I have a surprise.
What's the
and
surprise?
It's not. I ran out of wrapping paper. I couldn't wrap the whole thing. But sitting next to me, is a good friend of all of ours, Dr. Gerard Tate, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank
Welcome,
you for
Doc.
having me back here. I feel like this is a second home now. I'm
It
always
is.
happy to be back here.
Yeah.
So first time in the podcast room, which is absolutely amazing. So thank you for having me.
Well, we're excited. We're excited that you're here. I'm kind of push out a few tidbits of information for all those that have joined us again. First of all, thank you for revisiting us here and trusting us with just about 30 minutes of your time on Friday morning so that we can move this thing forward. It takes all of us, but when we say that, really what we mean is we need all of us, and that's you, the viewer. And so we would encourage you and all of your friends and family to subscribe, whether on the Facebook page, but really to our YouTube channel, the Echo Stop Live podcast on YouTube. And of course, during the show, we'll take emails. So if you want to send something to echostoplive@gmail.com, that's echostoplive@gmail.com. It's up on your screen right now. Each show, we try to get to at least one email question and help to communicate. And as you'll see here a little bit later on, we also like to follow up with those people that have sent us emails during the week and after the show. I think it's super important. But
It is.
not to waste any more time, Dr. Tate. So tell us, who is Dr. Tate? How did he get here? And
Well, we know who Dr. Tate is, but tell the world who is Dr.
No,
Tate.
How did you
for
wind
sure.
up here? The Gulf Coast is really curious.
It is, first, it's beautiful here. I'm Dr. Gerard Tate. I am the Director of Community Impact and Engagement at ShotSpotter. I've been there for about 18 months. I'm originally from the south side of Chicago, Army military police veteran, Iraq war veteran, and now master's and doctorate level social worker who works directly with police departments and cities to develop a holistic approach to combat gun violence and address trauma using a public health approach.
We could absolutely take that one statement apart for probably about 4 hours, but you
could,
said
we
so
could.
many really cool things in there. I mean, you had me at holistic approach. I think Curtis set me straight on this, but this is the primary reason behind this podcast.
It's all about this podcast. It's about that holistic approach, that collective impact approach. So I'm eager to hear what all Dr. Tate has to share with everyone.
So you mentioned social work. I mean, why social work? Why? I mean, what drew you into social work, and how do you see that affecting the mission, the bigger mission that we all face today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, initially, I never thought I would go from a military law enforcement officer and criminal investigator to become a social worker. But I experienced trauma in investigating crimes, particularly crimes against children in the military. And I needed the services of a clinical social worker. It is through that interaction that I learned, and kind of my clinical social worker let me know, hey, it'd be a good idea if you look into this as well, initially to go and graduate from that and go help other law enforcement officers who were experiencing trauma. In social work school, I learned a lot about social and economic development and the impacts that poverty has on cognitive development, mindsets, and violence. An aha moment went off, like, hey, not only can I do the clinical work, but I can do policies, programs, best practices.
And what I'm hearing you say there is so fascinating, Curtis. We've had this conversation. Tell me your thoughts on this, but I mean, sometimes in law enforcement, we distance ourselves from even the concept of social work when, in fact, they're integral, interrelated, and inseparable, in my opinion.
Right. Dare I say that we work in a social service field? I mean, we're laughing about it, but we honestly do. We're just tasked to do a particular function or serve a particular function in that service. But there are other agencies and disciplines that help support what we do and we them.
Well, I mean, I think you have to look, I want to say beyond the arrest, but really it's the before the arrest. If we could do our job and we could accomplish everything we needed to accomplish and nobody ever had to get arrested. And I mean, this would be a perfect world, but we live in a broken world and it's fallen.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is the intent behind it is not to just go out and arrest a bad person, although that's necessary.
Right.
But all of those families in between and the victims and even the offenders who each have a story. I mean, there's social work in all of that, right?
Absolutely.
So, tell us, Dr. Tate, like based on that, how does it become necessary for somebody to collect data, to do analysis, and to do these things, to really figure out what the social work piece is, and how does that impact a community?
Yeah, so first I think in looking at social work, we have to understand that most of us have had at least some interaction formally or informally with social services or social work in some form, whether you lived in subsidized housing or you have food assistance or you use WIC. Or your children go to school. Most schools have school social workers and counselors. When life happens and they need additional help and referral to services and supports, or when a law enforcement officer, you have contact with them and you let them know you have a need or they assess you have a need, them being able to contact social workers to help you navigate that process is vitally important. And we all have family problems sometimes, right? And so there are social workers who are specifically trained in doing family support and treatment. And so social work and policing have kind of always been one for a long time. Much of my doctoral research was around police social work. And the adoption of police social work started with women in policing, women police bureaus that were mostly former social workers and teachers designed to go work with families and children in the 20s and 30s. So we've already knew for a very long time that there needed to be a need for that perspective and lens. We just kind of lost it.
Yeah. So I was going to ask that question. You said we lost it. So where did we go sideways, and how do we get back to where we need to be?
Yep. So I think even before the war on drugs, we look at prohibition and some other things.
Right.
We started to criminalize mental health and health issues, whether that be addiction, whether that be depression. Whether that be after World War II, a large number of veterans coming back, particularly African-American veterans needing a place to live, and many of them were not allowed to use the GI Bill for housing. We saw policing start to make a turn and a shift in inner cities when we started to mass low income, particularly minorities, in public housing in areas. And you will even see now in many areas where gun violence exists and persists, it's around public housing areas, low income areas, where we know the social, economic, and health deficits that need to be addressed. But we've only been sending police for the most part for the better part of 3 decades.
And going back to what you said about the 1920s, and how
that's not
women,
quite back to the SRP
I know
time
it's
frame.
not. That's more 1829.
Okay. All right. You're close.
But going back to women coming into the field of law enforcement for, I dare say, a primary function of going in, assessing, and identifying to help mitigate things that were happening during the 1920s in families, because they knew then that this had a mushroom effect on the community at large.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you start to think about that time, we had financial difficulties, to say the least, in this country. Housing was not what it is now. There were a lot of social and economic ills that exist today that existed very much back then. And so we know that we needed a different approach. And in that, we hired women into policing to address those social, emotional, family issues, but we also developed federal, state, and local policies to help with housing, economic development, all of those, to drive down that crime and disorder.
So when you're looking at having a vision, Curtis,
Right.
Obviously you and Dr. Tate engaged early on in the launch of Operation Echo Stop, and I've told many people that I talked to, I'm like, had it not been for this opportunity for Curtis to really use the vision that he had and engage with people like Dr. Tate, I don't know how hard it would be to get, but where do you see? So, tell a quick story on like how you came across Dr. Tate, what his involvement was, and when you first recognized that there was something of value there in the community engagement piece.
I think because Dr. Tate has served in law enforcement, the field of law enforcement, as we all have, and still do, understanding that he's seen very much some of the similar things that I saw working in investigations, child abuse cases, physical abuse cases, sexual abuse cases, and working in other areas of homicide. And you see the impact from the investigator, that person or detective, understanding that you're not a robot, okay? And what you see, the trauma that happens, that you see, not just the person who's no longer with you from one of the worst case situations being a death, but those that are indirectly impacted, as well as those who are directly impacted by that death, and what they go through as a family, as a unit, is devastating. And if you don't understand that, you lose sight of the importance of what you do as a detective or investigator.
Well, this is a great segue. We're talking about violent crime. And so, what I want to throw out there is a couple things. One, I would love for you to subscribe your friends and family to the YouTube channel or us on Facebook and follow this podcast. But also, we have a tip line. It's 844-251-0644. That's 844-251-0644. We're talking about crimes. If you see something, we have this anonymous tip line. It takes all of us, see something, say something. We would encourage you to actually do something. And along those lines, we've got a little promo video we want to show you that really ties into sort of the industry that Dr. Tate comes from. But after we watch this video, we're going to go even deeper into what really drives his cause. So we watched this promo video here for ShotSpotter. You obviously work for ShotSpotter. Yes. And I think our viewers have heard us talk about ShotSpotter. And they're thinking about gunfire in their community. And that is a huge problem, and we're working on that. But we also discovered several shows back that, if you were to take that 100% mark and you were to divide it up into percentages, that we're really facing essentially a 30% gunfire problem and a 70% perception problem. Mm-hmm. And that's significant. And so when you watch this promo, when you talk about ShotSpotter, which is the tool that's used to detect the shots that are being fired, but really we want to go deeper than that. Mm-hmm. And I know because I've had several conversations with you and I spent some time with you. And I significantly value your thought and your insight because you've really put a lot of thought and insight into this. ShotSpotter is more than just a gunshot detection tool in terms of the resources that they provide, not only to the agencies they service, but the community where those resources are being utilized, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think ShotSpotter Respond, which is the acoustic gunshot detection technology, has historically mostly been used in partnership with policing. A few years ago, some of my colleagues before I came on board was like, we need to do much more with that data and information. And that culminated in about 18 months ago, ShotSpotter hiring a doctor of social work to come in and say, how else can we use this data and all of our products and technology to have a much more positive impact on the community beyond the benefits of fast response and saving lives. When I saw Echo Stop, and then I learned this Operation Echo Stop, it was at the same time that I was reading research around the adverse cognitive psychological effects of the sounds of gunfire on particularly children and young adults. Mm-hmm. And so as I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, I think someone understands that even the sounds of gunfire have negative health effects and can lead to negative behavioral outcomes that lead young people particularly to be more hypervigilant, more prone to violence. And so where we know that upwards of 80% of gunfire goes unreported, which I think we may touch into a little bit later on, we don't have that data precisely where that potential trauma is happening. So now that we do, when you bring in ShotSpotter Respond, what do we do with that data? Now we know where more than 97% of our coverage area of gunfire is occurring. What are we doing with that data and information if we know it's potentially traumatizing children and youth, who then have to go to school the next day after being traumatized, who may have some long-term adverse effects.
And that's the data for good.
Yep.
So what we're really talking about is taking the information that we've culminated, and you said this, and I did as well early on as well, which is until we launched this program, until we started collecting the data from these analysis tools, we don't really know what we're trying to tackle. We don't know how significant the problem is. And now that we know what we're facing, now we can put together the adequate resources. Your team's been out in the community from day one.
Right. I've always said that all information is relevant information. All data, regardless of what it may be, is relevant to the then and now, as well as what to expect later. One of the things that we often ignore or have ignored in the past up till now is that information that is not directly connected to the apprehension of someone in law enforcement is not necessarily relevant, but we miss so much by categorizing information and putting it, for lack of a better term, in a closet or a file cabinet, if we even in fact recognize it as being valuable. So what we have to do is start looking at it from a holistic standpoint, making sure that we connect the dots, not just what we do in law enforcement, but what partner agencies are doing, okay? What the hospitals are doing, what do they see that we're unaware of? What is mental health seeing that we're unaware of? What are the schools seeing that we're unaware of? And it's busting silos. It's getting that information that can be shared, because there's tons of information that can be shared. We oftentimes go back and say, well, we can't release that information because it's HIPAA protected. Well, not necessarily, especially when it has something to do with the best interest of the community.
So let me ask you this question, because you guys can either one of you answer this and jump in at the same time or at separate times. It don't matter to me. But what I'm thinking is, and I'm going to use some of your intervention specialists or other folks, even victim advocates in general. If something happens and you know that it happens because you're alerted or somebody calls you, then you are able to make a response. But what I'm really hearing from this data for good is we might even be on the predictive side. We might even know. We might even be able to put our finger on potential trauma, potential negative influence incidents before they either become an incident or the things that would go undetected and unnoticed. And so then there's essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, members of our community, members of society who are forced or essentially left to deal with this trauma on their own because the data wasn't there to trigger our alert. And so how do you guys deal with that? So now we have the data, now we know more. How do you get more involved with more data?
Well, let me say this real quick, and I want Dr. Tate to kind of just expound on it for me. And I share this all the time in groups that I go to sometimes, and that is, basic example is this: you have a situation where law enforcement responds to a home at 10 o'clock at night. There is a woman who's been abused by her boyfriend or her husband, and there is a small child, also their school-aged child. Law enforcement takes a report, guy goes to jail, mom goes to the hospital, and grandma picks up the grandchild and take the grandchild to her home. Well, he gets up the next morning. Maybe it's still morning. Maybe it's morning when they finally get to her home. And she feeds him breakfast, and he goes to school the next day or the same day. And he's no fit for being open for learning than anyone who's experienced something so horrible and so bad. But he goes to school because grandmother sent him to school. That's what she does. He gets there and he's non-responsive. He lays his head on his desk. Teacher, unknowing of what's going on, tells him to raise his head. He does not. At some point, she calls him out in class, and he responds with vulgarity. From there, he's escorted to the office where he's upset because all these things that no one knows about, he's upset about. So now he's starting to really vent. Before long, the police are now there. And no sooner than that officer walks in, that kid recognized that officer from the night before. And that kid goes to the youth center for disorderly conduct because that officer also witnessed the behavior. But he didn't realize that he went to the same house where that child was the night before or the night of, or the morning of, and he was a witness to a violent crime. And this child now has been basically exposed to 2 traumatic events.
So we've connected the dots in the circle, but what I'm hearing my good friend Curtis say is without the training component, without the advisory component, without teaching people how to use that data for good, then the data really doesn't have value in and of itself if it's not being utilized in the appropriate way. So here, that simple form of data is essentially something that really needed to be used. And this actually this brings up a pretty good opportunity to talk about something that happened a couple of weeks ago. We received an email, and we wanted to kind of just talk about it for a minute. But we had a viewer of ours send in an email and essentially say that he hears us talking about calling police. We need you to call 911. We have an extremely low number of people call 911 when they hear gunfire. And first of all, we appreciate you sending in that email. Second of all, the concern that you expressed was that why should I or why should anybody call the police? Because several years ago you had called for an incident and nothing happened. And first and foremost, I'll tell you that the whole purpose behind this show is to have this conversation, to not pretend like these emails don't exist, and to answer you directly. And, obviously I can't speak to what happened a couple of years ago, but I can tell you this. The reason you should call police is because we've launched Operation Echo Stop. And within our efforts to launch Operation Echo Stop, we have put in place mechanisms, training, people, and resources who want to better serve than they've ever served before. And this isn't a knock on our officers. We have some of the greatest police officers around, and I've lived in many cities, I can say that. But we have orchestrated dialogues, panels like we have here, our podcast, efforts in the community. We put tools and resources out. We have gunshot detection teams that are out there looking to respond. And so we're asking for your help. We're asking you to move past whatever has happened a couple of years ago in that response and give us another chance to show you how it should be done and let us respond that way. Now, we can't ask you to move past the trauma without proper dealing with that trauma.
Right.
But what we are asking you to do is to give us the opportunity to show you how this type of thinking and how this type of engagement works. What are your thoughts? And thank you for sending that email. What are your thoughts on that?
We're going to pivot to Dr. Tate.
Yeah, so first, I think as traumatic incidents continue to occur, whether it's acute, it's happening right now, it's one time, it's chronic, it's ongoing, you got complex traumas, different traumas that occur. But what I hear from that email is he's unfortunately had to normalize hearing that gunfire. And he may have been in crisis before. It may have been a long-term exposure to this violence. And what we know is long-term exposure to violence and trauma can potentially have negative adverse effects on your mental health and wellness. But he wants to be heard as well, right? And so we talked about a little bit about a low number of people calling 911. That is the gap that ShotSpotter Respond acoustic gunshot detection seeks to fill. Well, we will alert you 97% in our coverage area, above 97% of gunfire that happens in that area. So when people have unfortunately normalized not calling in, we know the precise location. Now, to your point, Commander, once we have that data, what do we do with it?
Right.
Because even if an officer responds and nobody is hit, fortunately, maybe they collect evidence, but then they have to go to the next call. And that's why I was really excited, Commander Grace, about your team, who has the ability to do family intervention, to do outreach, to do engagement, to do follow-up. But we talked about holistic when we first came here. That means beyond the police department.
And I wanted to point out that that's not common in the state, is it, to have all this in-house?
No, it's not. We're one of few agencies in Alabama, actually one of two, that have a systems-based victim services program. The other is Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. That's not a municipality. That's a county. And of course, we see the heaviest volume of incidents in our cities. So we are truly the only city that has a systems-based victim services program in the state of Alabama.
And that shocked me, which is why I've been spending so much time here, because that lessens the time a patrol officer has that interaction with a resident who's in need, and the time that they can get them the services, where traditionally they have to call other social service agency at the county, maybe a nonprofit agency that's receiving funding from the city or county. It may not be a smooth handoff. Here you have them in-house to handle that acute stress and trauma, to refer them, to stay with them, to do case management until they can get to some follow-on care. And that is unique and something we need to scale across the nation.
Yeah, and I feel like, we're talking about community members and how community members can engage with us. So we have programs, we have data, we have some training. How do we bring that street level? How do people? We keep saying it takes all of us, and we believe that, and we're doing that, and we're going to the community, we're having events, we're being resources. But when it comes to trauma, how do we bring resources to the communities to deal with trauma on these cases, whether it's case by case or some sort of rather larger scale?
One of the pieces to the puzzle that we put together over the last couple of years was Project Thrive. It stands for Trauma, Healing, Resiliency in the Wake of Violent Events. And we have about 35 partners with that nonprofit that we established some years ago under OSI, my office. And the intent is to help, first of all, bring everyone that has a stake to the table. And everyone has a stake to the problem. So we bring them to the table, but the goal is to educate the public. Prevention is key, but in order to prevent, you have to give knowledge, information, so that they can take that information and then process that information when they're in crisis or before they get in crisis to make the right decision that will result, hopefully, in minimizing the outcome of a problem that they may be encountering.
Well, I unfortunately have some news for you, Dr. Tate. We're coming to the end of the show.
Yes.
And as with all podcasts that we end here, we just want to reflect for just a minute. But I have to say personally, so I got to intercede personally with a thought. And when you are surrounded by people who care as much as you two do, it's an extremely powerful thing. And so I'm blessed and grateful to be sitting here with you guys. And I'm already encouraged to do this type of effort because I feel like if we don't, what else?
Right.
But to be surrounded by people who are also engaged in their own ways in this same type of effort, it's really encouraging to us. And I hope that those of you that are watching for just a split second, can just feel some of that passion and vision that we have here, and we want to transfer that to you. We want to send that out to the community. We want to do that through all of the good efforts and the good tasks that we can, and brainstorm and keep coming up with these great ideas. We don't know yet what we don't know, but we know that if we keep thinking the way we're thinking, we will bring great things to the community. So stay tuned. Keep tuning in to us. I want to remind you again that there's a 800 number. It's 844-251-0644. 844-251-0644. We would encourage you to call or text. You can even scan a QR code if you see one of the signs around town and anonymously send us information on cases. Let us help you help our community as a whole really make this the great place that we know it can be. Dr. Tate keeps coming back, so he sees something here. We'll keep inviting him back. We're going to try and keep him here as long as we can. Yeah. But thank you all so much. And I don't know if you have a parting word, but we really appreciate you traveling as far as you have, just to spend a little bit of time with us here in the studio.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. It does take all of us. And so I think community members, whether it's through the anonymous tip line, whether it's through text, whether it's in engaging with your local law enforcement officers as you see them out and about in your neighborhood. The police are the community is the police. And so we want to make sure, and I know the commander support me in saying this, we want to make sure that you feel a part of the family because you are the family. This Data for Good initiative that we have is intentionally shared with schools and hospitals and other community violence intervention stakeholders so that those resources can more quickly and effectively get to you. And so we thank you for your support. Thank you for having me here.
Awesome. And my good friend Curtis, we must bid our audience farewell for another week. We'll see you next Friday at 8:30 in the morning. Tune in live for our Echo Stop Live podcast. Send us your emails, echostoplive@gmail.com. And in this holiday season, as we celebrate miracles, I would encourage all of us, if it takes all of us, to be a miracle to somebody. Go do something. Be part of the community and make this place the great place. And until then, we'll see you next Friday here in Mobile and all along the Gulf Coast. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.